Britain needs to do more to make itself a less appealing destination.
A less appealing destination, yes. Well, it's not France's fault if the British economy is thriving. No, more seriously, I think at top political level, it's clear that both David Cameron and François Hollande are trying to calm down, the rhetoric. They insist that there is enough cooperation between the two countries. We see the same between Bernard Cazeneuve, the Interior Minister, and Theresa May, the Home Secretary. So clearly I think that they are aware that this is a global crisis, a European crisis. But once again, as we said, the public opinions, are turning increasingly more hostile towards migrants. And we feel that indeed there is a great deal of pressure on Mr. Cameron. Now, why is Britain such a welcoming or an appealing place? Well, as we mentioned, maybe because it has a thriving economy, a very flexible labour market, the fact that you don't need an idea to find work. We hear that the black market as well is, of course, a possible source of revenue for these people. But Britain is not alone. You know that countries like Sweden, for instance, are also welcoming a lot of migrants. Germany, if anything, has been a most welcoming country in recent months. So this is a global trend. Of course, people will try to go where they can possibly find jobs. And those countries are, of course, Britain, Sweden, possibly France as well, but maybe there is the language barrier.
Well, except that, if I may, we're not talking about economic migrants here when it comes to the nationalities. Because... well, when it comes to people coming from Sudan or Eritrea, Iraq, I mean, we're definitely talking about people in need of international protection who, in fact, cannot access the job market that easily when it comes to the Britain regulations, even in France. I mean, now it's like the regulations in the EU are making it easier after a couple of months when your asylum request is being processed to access the job market. But it's not that easy, and a lot of asylum seekers are destitute. So I'm not really sure that these people represent such a threat for the economy of Britain. And in fact, when it comes to studies by a number of researchers, even in London, University of London, a couple of years back, has shown that migration benefits the UK economy. So the thriving economy you were actually mentioning earlier is benefiting from the contribution of those people who are actually paying taxes, not really benefiting from benefits either. Richard is the same.
Richard Ashworth, you want to contribute?
Yes, please, because I wanted to add to what Christophe said. He was exactly right when, of course, Calais is a hot spot, and of course it's dramatic, the events which are going on there, and of course we must find a solution. But please don't be under the presumption that that is the only problem or only destination of choice for migrants in Europe. Actually, statistically, the nation with the biggest number of migrants per capita is Sweden. In sheer numbers terms, Germany, Italy and Spain have way more of migrants heading there than does the United Kingdom. And secondly, there is a perception in Britain that, they're only coming here because of our welfare state. Actually, that's not true, and actually there's no evidence to support it. In particular, the migrants which I spoke to in Sicily last week, these are people who've only just made the crossing from Libya. Not one of them mentioned issues about welfare state or anything else. They had no conception of that. They were just wanting a better life. And one of the things which I was made aware of by the Italian government there was that one big issue we have is the people trafficking gangs, the criminal gangs. And they were telling me that it is now more profitable to traffic people than it is to smuggle drugs. And that's an illustration of the kind of problem we have today and the scale of the problem, and it is a very long-term problem.
Then we also bring in Isa Lectus from London, from Human Rights Watch. I mean, we've all been talking about Britain, and the reality is, as Richard just pointed out, I mean, Calais is not just the only flashpoint in all of this, but we are at this point concentrating on Calais and the fact there are so many people who want to head towards Britain. But my understanding is that when it comes to Britain, the fact is that in terms of the numbers of people that they've accepted from Syria, it's quite low compared to other European countries.
It is indeed, and I think it's important also to note that not everyone in Calais actually is so insistent on coming to the UK. I've spoken to many people who said to me, you know, if I had a place to sleep in France, if I had decent conditions to lodge my asylum claim, because I think, you know, we're talking about people who have fled, again, from persecution and from violence. They want to have an opportunity to claim asylum. And if they could do that in France in adequate conditions, I think many of them would do that. And many of them just walking around the camp in Calais, the current one, as you said, that's called the New Jungle in brackets. So in that one or the previous one, I spoke to many people and I'd say to them, well, why do you want to go to the UK? And they just look around and show me all the tents and the rubbish and just say, you know, how can I stay here? People who apply for asylum in France wait for months before they even have an interview. So I think there's, you know, we're talking about people who are on French territory, and there's a lot that France should be doing, and that those efforts to process their asylum claims quickly and give them a place to stay could go a long way in preventing people from taking these risks and some of them losing their lives.
Murray, just picking up from what Isa just said there, I mean, certainly France is gave the world bureaucracy, and that's one issue that crops up a lot when you talk to people who are seeking refugee status in this country.
Is definitely true. I mean, based on the information we have from the field, we know that some of the people in the jungle have a very virus situation. I mean, you can come across people who actually have a right to stay in an EU country where they actually couldn't make a living, or were actually facing racism, like in Italy, when it comes to people from the Horn of Africa. You also have people who actually lodge an asylum claim, actually their request is pending. Some actually were actually given the refugee status and were not provided with any accommodation yet. So that's very true. But I would say that, coming back to what Mr. Ashworth was saying, this is very true, it's a European problem. And looking at the figures of the Asylum and Migration Integration Fund, for example, when it comes to the reception of migrants, all the money is considered as an emergency crisis fund. So it's quite a lot of money that's given for this emergency fund, but there's nothing structural that's thought about. And I think that's where the heart of the problem is, really.
At this point, let me bring in France 24's James Andre, who's been spending the last 24 hours down there in Calais. And James, the people you've been talking to, are they all wanting to head to the UK, or are some of them actually happy to consider the notion of staying put in France?
Well, quite honestly, the people in this camp, I'd say it's a huge majority are trying to get to the UK. Most of these people who are living in these tents behind me, they try relentlessly day after day to try and get to the UK. Now, of course, I've asked them why. So they do say that the fact that there is no ID system, you know, no ID card in the UK, the fact that it's easier to get a job on the black market is part of the reason. But the other reason is the networks they have over in the UK. A lot of people were telling me they have friends, relatives, friends with whom they've travelled from their original countries, people they crossed the desert with, crossed the Mediterranean Sea with, who have managed to get through the tunnel, now established in the UK, and tell them that, you know, they can help them out once they get there. But quite clearly, if we take this specific camp, we're talking about 2,500 people. There are some people who've been here for a few months and who are telling me that they're waiting, that, you know, for example, we spoke to an Afghan man who was telling us that he tried for the first month every day and night to get across the channel, and he said, well, you know, I got hurt twice. After the second time I decided to stay put, give it a bit of time and see if I can find a safer way to the UK. But every single one of these people that we've been speaking to tells us they want to go to the UK. They also say that the situation here, of course, is dire, as you can see, and they say that they're not getting enough help from the French and that it's difficult to set up here and make a life here. But they still all, or nearly all, want to go to the UK.
Now, Christophe, Calais has joined other spots in Europe that are becoming synonymous with the continent's inability to deal with this massive tide of migrants. If you're going to take a look at a map that we've got here, you'll see these flashpoints include the islands of Lampedusa in Italy and Lesbos in Greece, where many migrants first land. Excuse me, the fence that Hungary is now erecting along the border with Serbia, and also towns such as Ventimiglia in Italy, which is on the border with France, where the authorities are working very hard to make it harder for them to proceed. But the reality is, at the end of the day, just like Calais, these places are being overwhelmed, aren't they?
And it's pretty logical if you look at the map of Europe, because most people arrive in Europe from Libya or from Turkey. Now, we hear that a lot of asylum seekers aren't registered in Greece, so that the Greeks are turning a blind eye, letting them go through Macedonia. They end up in Serbia and enter the EU through Hungary. Hence, Hungary's very controversial decision to erect a wall on its border. But you're right, these places are under pressure. The island of Kos and Lesbos in Greece, Lampedusa. There is a very strange EU rule called the Dublin legislation, which says that...
Which Richard was referring to
absolutely,
earlier.
Technically, it means that an asylum seeker who wants to file for asylum in the EU must do so in the country where he entered the Union. So that means most of the time Greece, Malta or Italy, these countries are overwhelmed, they can't cope, so they're letting some people go. They end up in France, and from France they want to go to Britain. Now, we talked about France. It's true that we hear that there are problems in France, but when you look at the figures, France is actually welcoming a large amount of Syrians. It's probably not enough given the extent of the crisis, but I mentioned that the Commission has asked EU countries to welcome 60,000 migrants. Well, France has agreed to welcome roughly 10,000 people, which amounts to 15% of the total amount. But given the extent of the crisis, as we discussed, I mentioned the 1.5 million refugees who are currently in Lebanon. This tells you that Europe isn't doing a lot.
Richard Ashworth, how do you actually get agreement from politicians to do something about migration and this problem when unemployment in Europe is so high and we're seeing the ascendancy of far right-wing parties?
It is high, and of course there are problems there, and that makes it very difficult to get an agreement. But I'm afraid until all 28 member states come to take ownership of this problem and come to realise that it is a very long-term problem, it's a global problem. We've said earlier in the programme, Australia, Southeast Asia, United States of America, all the wealthy, peaceful areas of this world are magnets drawing people, whether it's fleeing violence, whether it's because of their better economic prospects. But it is a global issue which is here for a lifetime. There's no quick fix. I'm confident that we can make it more difficult to cross over the channel at Calais. I'm confident that a result can be found there, but that won't stop the issue. And politicians have got to understand that it is a collective problem from Europe, because the entry points we've been talking about, we've talked about Hungary, we've talked about Turkey to Greece, we've talked about Libya to Lampedusa. These are all the areas which are, by and large, the poorer regions of Europe. They're less well-resourced, and you can't expect those regions to actually act as gatekeepers for Sweden, for Britain, for France, for Denmark, for the Netherlands and for Germany. So there has to be a much more collective effort, and that collective effort has got to aim focus our fire at source, at the borders of Syria, actually in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, and in the Ukraine, because otherwise this will just continue year after year, and we will be into this crisis management for years to come.
But Richard, at the end of the day, no politician is going to win votes by being nice to migrants.
No, but I'm sorry, but politicians have to tell the people what they need to know. You can't keep reacting to the extremes of politics, saying that we're going to treat them brutally, we're going to kick them out and we're going to get tough on them. Because a lot of these people are fleeing violence. They're fleeing for their lives from places like Syria and Mali and Eritrea. These people have nowhere else to go. But only by getting to the source can we sort out who are genuine migrants and who are economic migrants. Now, it is actually true that the European economy will need a large influx of migrants, a migrant workforce over years to come, because in Europe we're all getting older. And the European Commission has worked it out that about over the next 10 years we'll need about 17 million migrants. But it's got to be controlled. And at present, we're not controlling the migrant flow. We're not in control of the situation. And that's what the 28 member states through the European Union have got to get together and start to get a policy to manage it.
Just very briefly, yet another sign as to how difficult it is for the member states to accept that Europe has to meddle and to coordinate the relocation of migrants. Britain has used its opt-out in order not to participate in the relocation programme. Britain will resettle 2,000, I believe, migrants, but it won't relocate migrants coming from Italy. So it is very controversial. It is very difficult for leaders to explain, and I think we really have to make a distinction and explain the difference between economic migrants who want to reach Europe in order to get jobs and earn a living, and asylum seekers who are protected by international law, and it's a duty, it's a responsibility for the EU member states to examine their requests.
Marie?
Well, I think there's a very, very, very worrying trend politically right now.
Can I come back on that?
Politicians are actually reacting to what public opinion wants. But there is a very big responsibility by policymakers, first of all, not to explain, but also fueling this trend. And to come back to what Mr. Ashworth was saying when it comes to stemming the flow, addressing the root causes of what migration, whether forced or not, is about. This is already in the making. This has been done for the past 15, 20 years, and this is called the externalization of border control. When we're talking about hotspots, and when we're talking about information centre in Niger, or even about the Khartoum process. I mean, the European
It was the
Union...
case in Libya, by the way, where Gaddafi was given money in order to keep the migrants.
But this is already happening.
The
EU is having actually some cooperation with Sudan at the moment when it comes to border management, and this is not possible.
Let me just hear what Richard has to say to that.
Well, just picking up from a point there, yes, you know, you need to understand that the whole, what we call middle Mediterranean flow, in other words, Libya to Lampedusa, is an unintended consequence of the Arab Spring and more recently the conflict in Libya, because it's created a lawless country where people traffickers are getting extremely rich out of this trade, and they're encouraging it. But can I take you back to one point with regard to the United Kingdom, where it is said that the United Kingdom opted out of the share out of migrants? Please remember that the United Kingdom already has a huge migrant issue because of what I term empire and commonwealth. And one of the things we found in the United Kingdom, the limitation at the rate you take people into the country is the rate at which you can integrate them into our society. One of the lessons we learnt from the 7/7 bombing was that the rate of inflow had been too great. People hadn't integrated in society. They felt cut off from British society, and that created an atmosphere which bred violence in the way that it did. So in defence of the United Kingdom, I would say we already have a very, very big migration issue. All right, it doesn't come through Calais, but it is because of empire and commonwealth. We have to manage that. And we're perfectly prepared to do our share in this issue, but collectively, Europe has to realise all 28 member states are involved in this, all have to take ownership of the issue, and all have to understand this is there's no quick fix here. This is a long-term issue, it's a generational thing. And when you think how long it took to persuade the public, we had a climate change issue. Everybody accepts it now, but it took a long time. So I think to sway public opinion to accept that we need to act at source is a long-term job, and we need programs like this to be able to get that message over.
Let me just bring in...
We're living with a generational thing.
Richard,
it's a global issue.
Richard, let me just bring in Isa Lectus from Human Rights Watch. Given what Richard was just saying, what's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to add that we, in this whole debate, we hear a lot about border enforcement and certainly from the UK about tackling smugglers and traffickers that are exploiting people. But what we're really talking about is people who have fled from violence, from wars, and they've taken a very dangerous journey and a very expensive journey. People do that when they feel that they didn't have a choice. So we really need to see more solidarity and more responsibility sharing between the countries of the European Union. And certainly countries like France and the UK have the means. I mean, these countries have ratified treaties and conventions basically that they need to offer protection to people who come to them and require it to people who are genuine refugees. And I think this is missing sometimes in the way that politicians talk about it, but also in the way that the media portray the issue.
Richard, do you think the time has come for Britain to introduce ID cards?
Well, certainly that is an issue, and it's been discussed earlier. It would be one way of dealing with that issue, and that's something for the British government to understand. But I think also what isn't helpful is we've had a debate in Britain which calls everybody who crosses a border a migrant. Now, there is a world of difference between the person we've talked about on this programme, who is somebody who got out of Syria, husband, wife and 2 children, and got out with their lives. Now, they are genuine refugees, and there's no way that you could send them back. So that's one class of what we call migrant. The other is the economic migrant, who's coming for financial reasons. But the third in Britain is a class migrant, is actually European citizens exercising the right of free movement within the European Union. So we've got to almost dismantle that debate and identify those 3 groups of people rather than addressing them all and thinking of them all as migrants trying to get through a fence at Calais, because they're absolutely not.
Richard, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid that's it for this portion of the France 24 debate. It's time now for Media Watch. And I'm joined here in the studio by Media Watch's James Creedon, and you've been looking at reactions to British Prime Minister David Cameron's use of the word swarm to describe those migrants waiting to enter Britain.
That's right, as we were just hearing from the last guest, the importance of the use of language and distinctions between different migrant categories, but also, I suppose, the use of emotive language or even perhaps irresponsible language that has been pointed to in the British press today. This is a journalist for the Huffington Post UK edition who, you've got a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean seeking a better life. Now, that's a quote from David Cameron, which Rob McDowell of the Huffington Post calls appalling language and sentiment. Indeed, the opposition, many in the opposition have been critical of that as well. He's talking about people, not insects. That is the interim leader of the Labour Party speaking there. Meanwhile, the leader of the UK Green Party, Natalie Bennett, for her part, took to social media and she said, no, swarms isn't an appropriate word for desperate homeless human beings, including children fleeing persecution and wars. A similar statement by Andy Burnham, who is the shadow he's in the shadow cabinet. I can't remember exactly his portfolio. Shadow Secretary for Health, I believe. And he said calling Calais migrants a swarm is nothing short of disgraceful. So as you can see, an array of opinions criticising that statement. Now, the British press, as we've been talking about, has been very critical of French authorities for not doing enough to prevent people from entering that tunnel. That's right. A quick look at a headline in the Courrier International. So the French view of the British view of the French view, saying essentially that France must not avoid its responsibilities in that regard. So they're summing up, I suppose, the UK press reaction in that regard. There's one tweet that I think is, I hope it's tongue-in-cheek anyway. This is from I think he's, let me check before I make a mistake, Roger Helmer. I think he is in MEP for the East Midlands. It doesn't say which party, but perhaps he's being tongue-in-cheek when he says that Calais was British until 1558 and maybe it's time to take it back again. In any case, in terms of press reaction, I think you could call this is certainly an example of the more extreme, simplistic way of reporting on it from The Sun. Softy, Calais goes ballistic, Frenchies are atrocious. And they sent some reporters to Calais who said that illegal migrants have been breaking into the Channel Tunnel through the same hole in the fence for 13 years. And they found a hole some 300 metres from the freight and car terminal which a Sun photographer photographed in 2002. Now, one would imagine they may have repaired it between 2002 and 2015, but it appears not to have been fixed, according to the Sun.
Never let the facts get in way of a story,
Yes, and that is quite a tall tale, I think, if they're claiming it hasn't been repaired in 13 years.
Finally, and very quickly, the French newspaper Le Monde has a more human face on the story, interviewing both migrants and doctors in Calais.
That's right. This is the quote, the headline here is, I tried to get into England every day. That is a quote from a 22-year-old Afghan boy, Alam Ahmadzai, who has thick bandages around his wrist where skin has been ripped off, essentially, and he says that he tries to get into England 2 or 3 times every day. They also spoke to a doctor, François Patry, he's a volunteer who's been there for the last 10 days. He says you have a huge amount of 12, 13, 14-year-olds with deep puncture wounds from barbed wire fences and lots of other injuries. And he says this is directly linked to the increased security, in fact, along the perimeter of the highway, which means that greater risks are being taken at the entry point of the tunnel. So it's increased security, in fact, that is behind this crisis.
James Credon, we're going to have to leave it there. Let me also thank my guests for tonight's France 24 debate. And do stay with us, because there'll be more news and headlines very shortly.